Okay, guys, we're picking up where we left off. We were talking about Skinner, and he didn't use a lot of those traditional techniques that we've talked about with psychoanalysis. Of course, he thought everything should be focused on behavior and research, so that's the kind of therapy he did. So he did a lot of behavior modification, which we've talked about. You can still use with children, with animals, with your partner. And so you're trying to change a behavior based on reinforcing a different behavior. So that would be, a behavior that you want to have instead of what they are doing, or to stop reinforcing a behavior. So if you're accidentally reinforcing children for throwing a temper tantrum in the line at the checkout by giving them candy, then you have to look and see what is reinforcing that behavior and then stop it. So it begins with kind of like a functional analysis of behavior, where you look at the antecedents of the behavior, what's happening before, then the behavior, then the consequences that's maintaining the behavior, and then stopping that. So there's a couple of other things that really were focused on as far as behavior modification. So discrimination training, so certain situations where behaviors are okay and learning those behaviors are okay only in certain situations. So you only eat when you're sitting at the table and not at other times, and that makes you less likely to overeat. Also, look, he used timeout. Well, he didn't use timeout, but he would have encouraged timeout because he didn't like punishment. But timeout actually is a form of punishment, because you are trying to decrease a behavior by taking away something. So it's actually negative punishment. You're taking away a parent's attention, and then they get to come back out of timeout when they are done. So you're, taking away their access to positive reinforcers, and then they lose a positive reinforcer. So we talked about like grounding, those kinds of things are used in behavior modification. And in applied behavior analysis, they do this very specifically with autistic children, looking at things that motivate them. So there's lots of great videos. I'll put one on Moodle about ABA and reinforcing certain behaviors. Sometimes I'll do this with stickers. Sometimes I'll do this with attention. Sometimes I'll do this with tickles. Or smiles, or time on a video game that the child likes. So finding out what that child likes and then using that to reinforce certain behaviors like paying attention or making eye contact. That's how we use this for autism. Other things that we have used his theory for include habit reversal. So making behavior that is completely incompatible with a current behavior. They do this with things like Tourette's, where they have to do something that's completely opposite of the tic. That can also be done with OCD. A token economy, we just talked about this, and abnormal actually for people who are on an inpatient unit or some kind of closed environment where certain behaviors are rewarded, and then they can collect a number of points and then cash those in for certain things. Aversive techniques, I'll put a link up for this too, is when you use some kind of punishment to stop a behavior. And a good example of this would be using certain like antabuse to get people to stop drinking alcohol, because it makes them feel sick in their stomach every time they drink. They used to do some kind of counter conditioning like this, aversive techniques, to try to treat people who are pedophiles, and even for conversion therapy, where they would shock people when they would show them what they didn't want them to be attracted to. And it doesn't work very well. And so that's why it's not used very often, but it is something that can be used. So antabuse is probably the most common way it's used now. And then we already talked about differential reinforcement of opposing behavior in class. Some other things that they have applied his theory to is education. Prior to Skinner and some of the other therapists, like Adler that we've talked about, there was a lot of punishment involved in education. So they would like beat children to try to get them to remember their ABCs. You can imagine that would increase a lot of anxiety and not work very well for motivation. So punishment doesn't work. And also, trying some of Maria Montessori's methods of letting them do whatever they want may not necessarily work. So I know at like one of my sibling schools, they stopped doing positive reinforcement. So they took away the AR program for reading, which you're probably all familiar with, because they were afraid that was going to decrease motivation. But then children didn't have to read. Like they could just, use their time to watch YouTube videos or whatever. So being overly permissive does not work either. So what does work is having specific behaviors that are reinforced so children can learn based on achieving certain milestones or doing specific behaviors. So reading a certain amount or doing a certain number of math problems in a certain amount of time, and making those grades reinforcing as we talked about in class. And then Skinner also created kind of a whole society that he called Walden 2, where it was structured to meet individual community members' needs and was really based on the whole idea of reinforcement and how that could create what he thought was like some kind of utopian society. And so I'll also put this link up so that you can kind of see what this might look like. There are still some communities like this that exist, and I mentioned one in the book, and you can go to their website and check it out, that are very simplistic, but again, focused mainly on individual rewards and responsibility for behavior. So, there's some ways that he tried to apply this to society, and he really thought that we would all be better off if we use this kind of way of understanding people and their motivation to control society. So there are definitely some criticisms to Skinner's theory about personality development and just about behavior in general. So a lot of people were worried that he was taking free will away, and he didn't believe in free will, so that would have been a moot point for him. But a lot of people thought that he was manipulating people without them being aware of it. And you could see, like on the Big Bang Theory clip that I showed you, that's kind of what they were concerned about there, that Sheldon was manipulating Penny without her being aware of it. And that Skinner was trying to make himself the judge of what is a good behavior and what is not a good behavior. And then most of the research was done on things like mice and pigeons. He actually started on pigeons, not mice. And so it didn't take into account the thought processes that people have and how they are different than those from animals. And so it was a little too simplistic to understand people. And the whole idea of this being the whole cause of personality was a little too vague for some people. There are some great things, though, that Skinner did for psychology. He had a pretty comprehensive theory of behavior, of why people do things they do. And we talked about in class why you do a lot of the things you do are based on rewards and punishment. Even if they're not tangible, they might be things like praise. You were able to test his theory because he has some very specific criteria, and there was a lot of research was done on it. So there's a lot of strong empirical support. He also there was a lot of great applied value to his theory, and I talk about this a lot in the book, that we still use it to treat certain disorders like autism. We use different things from his theory to treat phobias, and there's just lots of uses for behavioral theory in both understanding people in general, but especially in clinical psychology. So I'll put those other links to the videos up on Moodle for you, and hopefully this will help you a little bit more understand Skinner. Make sure that you ask me any questions that you have, and good luck on your cases, and I'll see you Monday.